Hi, everyone. Welcome. Excited to enter this conversation today with Richard Louv. But while we're just waiting a couple minutes for everyone to arrive, if you want to type into the chat box where you're coming from today, that would be great. And we'll just give sort of 1 or 2 minutes quickly here to have folks come in. It's very exciting. Today is Take Me Outside Day. We'll chat about this a little bit more, but there are somewhere between 200 and 250,000 students and teachers across North America, I think in other places in the world as well, who are participating in Take Me Outside Day today and the events that we have this week. And yeah, really excited to, I think some teachers might not be able to participate today because they're already outside, but thankfully we're recording this chat today, and I know lots of teachers were interested in tuning in, and we'll share this with their students at a later date. Great. Some folks might join in the next couple minutes, but we're going to get going. Welcome. My name's Colin Harris. I'm part of the Take Me Outside team. Take Me Outside is a nonprofit organization committed to encouraging students and teachers to spend more time outside and to have that time be a regular part of every student's day. As I mentioned, we're really excited. This is the 12th annual Take Me Outside Day, and we're really excited that so many students and teachers across North America are spending time outside today. Outdoor learning comes with a lot of great benefits, and it gets you outside. It encourages you to be physically active while spending time in nature. It challenges you to think critically, to think creatively, to learn through new and hands-on experiences. Spending time outside might look different for everyone, but the importance of it doesn't change. It really helps us to change, turn us into change makers. So we're excited that you can take part in this webinar with Richard Louv today, but we're also hoping that you can go outside today and commit to that time outside and to help advocate and inspire other schools, students and teachers to spend more time outside for their learning as well. Today, I'm really excited to join you from Treaty 7 territory and Banff National Park. And I'm also excited to introduce Richard Louv as our guest speaker today. Richard Louv is an author and journalist of 9 books, including Last Child in the Woods, Saving Our Children from Nature Deficit Disorder, another book, The Nature Principle, Vitamin N, and then his most recent book, Our Wild Calling. Published in 24 countries, his books have helped launch an international movement to connect families and communities to nature. In 2008, he was awarded the Audubon Medal presented by the National Audubon Society. Prior recipients included Rachel Carson, E.O. Wilson, and President Jimmy Carter. Richard is also the recipient of the Cox Award for 2007, Clemson's University's highest honor for sustained achievement in public service. I'm personally really excited. My personal connection, I read Last Child in the Woods somewhere in 2007, 2008, and in part that inspired me to start the organization Take Me Outside. I got to hear Richard talk at a conference in Canada, and those were baby steps to really sort of inspiring this Take Me Outside movement, and the work that we, along with so many partner organizations, are trying to do across the country and in North America to really sort of advocate for outdoor learning. Richard, thanks so much for joining us today. Actually, where are you joining us today from?
I'm in a little town called Julian, California, and it's east of San Diego up in the mountains.
Great. Well, nice to have you here. We're enjoying a nice fall, at least in this part of the country. Actually, I think in most parts of the country in Canada, although Remy Rodden was just on singing earlier for students, and he's up in the Yukon and they had 25 centimeters of snow a few days ago. So they're into winter mode up there. Just for our audience, Richard and I are gonna have a conversation. But if there are any questions that come to mind for your class watching today, if you want to type that into the Q&A function, please feel free to do that. But I think the first question I wanted to ask Richard was, that first book when you talk about nature deficit disorder, wondering if you could just try and explain to students what nature deficit disorder is and why it's important.
The phrase or the term nature deficit disorder was suggested by my wife as we were driving down a freeway, ironically. And I have been telling her about new research about attention deficit disorder and showing that just a walk through trees in an urban park, the symptoms of attention deficit disorder would go down. She said, that sounds like nature deficit disorder. So late in the production of that book, I made that the spine or the repeating idea throughout the book. And it's not meant to say that one particular person has a disease, has nature deficit disorder. It's not a medical diagnosis. And I always say that when I introduce the idea. It is a way to talk about the disconnect between children and adults from nature, which is at an all-time historic high. And that has consequences. When you look at the studies, as you mentioned, a couple of them, when you look at the research that shows better health when you get outside more in nature, physical health, psychological health, better cognitive health, you learn better, you create better. There's a long list of benefits that come from a connection to the natural world. So the question is, what happens when you take nature away from people? What happens to those benefits? And I would argue that that nature connection is fundamental to who we are as people, as human beings, and that we really don't want to take that away. And one of the symptoms of societal nature deficit disorder is climate change, is the environmental issues that we face and seem not to want as a species to really solve yet. But I'm hoping that a lot more connection to nature is making that more likely.
For sure, and I think that's one of the pieces that I think we work on is just that importance of if students and teachers and all of us can spend more time outside and strengthen that relationship to the outdoors, in part, hopefully that helps us to care more about issues like climate change. I want to talk about, I think a lot of kids watching, a lot of students watching have probably watched some sort of comic book movie that have superheroes in them. We know that these superheroes have superpowers. Some scientists are saying that nature can give us superpowers or super senses. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, the scientists who study the human senses no longer talk about 5 human senses. That's what we usually talk about. They now talk about a minimum of 9 or 10 human senses. And some of the scientists who look at the human senses say that we have as many as 30 human senses, and they've named them. But many of these we don't know we have. I'll give you an example. We have some of the ability of bloodhounds, of dogs. to follow a scent through a trail through the woods. The students who participated in that study were college students. They were asked to be on their hands and knees, and they plugged their ears and covered their eyes, and they could literally follow a scent trail through the trees, just like a dog does, or a wolf. And the scientists doing the study noticed something. They noticed that the students zigzagged as they did this. That's what every animal that makes its living with its nose does. It zigzags as it follows the trail. There are a lot of other senses. Studies have been done of soldiers and why some of them just know that there's something down that alley and they shouldn't go down there, and others don't. And military studies have shown the ones who do know what's down that alley and want to avoid it, if possible, grew up in one of two places. They either grew up in tough inner city neighborhoods, or they grew up outside in nature, probably in a rural area where they spent a lot of time outdoors. In both those settings, you have to pay a lot of attention. So people have developed these senses more. Spatial senses, where we are in space, is one of those. I met a guy who teaches people how to be pilots of cruise ships. And he said he gets two kinds of students. One kind grew up on couches playing video games and all that. Nothing against video games. I'm not anti-tech. And he said they have abilities and talents that I need on my ships. Got a lot of electronics on my ships. He said the other kind of student grew up mainly outside, spent a lot of time, whether they hiked with their parents or they grew up on a farm, whatever they were. He said that kind of student also has talents that I need on my ship. That kind of student can, and he was being literal, he wasn't joking. He said they can actually tell where the ship is. They can sense where the ship, how close it is to the dock, whether it's about to hit the dock. They can sense direction much better. So their spatial senses have been very developed compared to the kids. So the last thing he said was the most interesting to me, which was his ideal student would be a student who had developed both ways of sensing the world. The way that happens when you spend a lot of time in the virtual world, and the way that happens when you spend a lot of time in the natural world. And in one of the books, I called that the hybrid mind, that we are at our most powerful as a species at this point in our history when we can do both those things.
Maybe that's the follow-up question about the hybrid mind. You know, it's tempting to say a lot of children spend a lot of time in front of screens, but I think a lot of humans spend a lot of time in front of screens. And again, like you said, it's not to be anti-screen or anti-technology, but there's also a balance that is needed. And right now there is a fairly significant imbalance based on the research that's being presented to us. But can you tell us a little bit about how technology and the natural world can be combined as the ultimate superpower?
Well, first, I want to mention that I have a kind of an equation that I suggest that we keep in our minds. Again, I'm not anti-tech. And the equation is the more high-tech we become, our lives become, the more nature we need. It's a budgeting question of time and money. It's a question of time for families and for individuals. It's a question of money for schools and government, et cetera. Where do they invest? In terms of can these two work together? There's a report just today about using extremely advanced sound sensing technology to begin to decode the communication among animals. I wrote about this in Our Wild Calling. There's a guy that puts up microphones and listens to prairie dogs. And prairie dogs are interesting. There's usually one or two at the edge, and ground squirrels do that. In my yard, ground squirrels do this, and they'll start beeping and making a sound. It's a warning sound, and through that warning sound, they found that the other prairie dogs or ground squirrels can actually tell whether the person, the danger approaching, is wearing a white hat. And the thing about animal communication and vegetation communication, particularly tree communication, is that there's a lot of it going on out there. So if we can begin to detect that and decode it using artificial intelligence, that's what the study today is about. We could have a much better idea of what animals are telling us and telling each other, and what trees are telling each other through the mycelium. They communicate often through strings of fungus that go underground between trees and among trees. You'll have a whole forest having quite a conversation, and we don't know what they're saying. But it looks like science might be able to help us begin to understand that.
Yeah, I mean, can you chat a little bit more about your latest book, Our Wild Calling, and sort of the interactions that humans have with animals can in some ways intrigue us. It can potentially encourage us to spend more time outside. What are some of the animal experiences that you have had or that people have told you that have sort of changed their outlook or their worldview on animals and our relationship to animals?
Well, let me tell you a cluster, and I'll try to tell them as fast as I can, because I tend to get into the stories and go on. One is my own story as a kid. I had a collie. In fact, the reflection is there. He's in this picture right here. It's a dog named Banner. And I spent a lot of time in the woods with Banner. And my parents often did not know where I was, but Banner always knew where I was. My dog always knew. And he would do interesting things. I mean, he pulled me out of a creek through the ice one time. I wasn't all the way under. I was up to my knees, but I couldn't get out of this ravine because it was covered with snow. The first thing he did is he went home, and my mother always knew that if Banner came home, then I was up to no good. Well, that day she wasn't home. She'd gone to the store or something. So Banner came back, and that's when I remember him at one end of a long branch and me at the other end. And memory is tricky. I may have romanticized that memory, but I don't think so. I wrote at one point that Banner taught me some ethics. I watched my dog, my collie, protect little dogs in the neighborhood. In those days, we didn't have many fences in suburban neighborhoods, and dogs ran as packs and they chased cars. They do all the things they're not supposed to do now. But Banner was often in fights, and he would often be fighting a larger dog that was picking on a little dog. There were a lot of other things he pulled my brother out of the street by his diapers and things like that. And I watched carefully Banner when I was 8 or 9, all the way up until I was 11, from when I was a toddler. And I made this statement. I was a newspaper columnist, and I wrote this in a column, that I thought Banner taught me some ethics. And I got this letter from an animal behavioralist who said, that's ridiculous. Animals don't teach ethics. That's ridiculous. You're romanticizing your dog. While I was researching Our Wild Calling, I was looking at where dogs come from. All dogs are related to gray wolves. Their ancestors were gray wolves. And there's a lot of discussion about who domesticated. How did gray wolves become domesticated? How did they turn into dogs, our friends? One theory is that we domesticated them. We threw bones out at the edge of the campfire and they came closer and closer, our ancestors. There's another theory, which is they domesticated us. And I actually think both of these are true. And that theory says that we followed families of wolves as they hunted. We watched how they cooperated, how they worked together. When you look at wolf families, they're very good families. And it's not only the mom and dad, it's the community of wolves that take care of the kids. And so in some senses, we learned from wolves, not only how they hunted, but the ethics of hunting, of cooperation. So what I like to think is that what they did, what the early wolves did, as they turned into dogs, passed down through evolution, tens of thousands of years, to my dog Banner. And he was teaching me ethics. Anyhow, I have a lot of other stories, and I spent too long on that one. If you want to hear others, I got others.
No, that's good. I mean, I think maybe, for me, it brings up the question of sometimes there's this disconnect between humans and nature. You could argue a disconnect between humans and animals. What could the future look like in terms of human-animal coexistence? What do you think the future could look like? What do you want the future to look like in terms of human-animal coexistence?
Um, I'll backtrack and tell a couple stories to illustrate that. Let me tell you, I wrote about a guy who's a friend who's an oceanographer at Scripps Institution of Oceanography in La Jolla, California. And he's one of the famous oceanographers among oceanographers. He's in his 80s now. When he was a student, he was down on the bottom of the Pacific Ocean off of Washington State, collecting specimens for his study that he was doing as a student. And he was facing the scuba gear, and he was facing the bottom of the ocean. And he wasn't paying a lot of attention, and suddenly he felt sensed something very large come above him and stop. That's usually not a good sign. And he looked up and he saw a big tentacle coming down. And he looked over here and he saw another big tentacle coming down. And he said it was a giant octopus, the kind that grow in the Pacific that can have wing spans of their arms that are over 12 feet. And he said it looked down at me and decided I was a clam, and it came down and got me. And it did. It wrapped him up. He said people think those tentacles are soft, anything but. He couldn't budge him. And he realized right then he was running out of air in his tank. So he pushed with all of his might against the bottom of the ocean, and the two of them went up, spiraling up, attached. And he said at some point, the octopus, he could feel its razor sharp beak coming around his neck until he was looking into the eye of the octopus. And he said at that point, and he laughs at himself when he says this, we made a non-aggression pact, the octopus and I. And at that point, when they had this recognition of each other, the octopus loosened its grip and began to move back. And right then, they both hit the surface of the water. And you look down, the octopus starts going back down, rips off his mask, and he's watching this. And what does he do? He puts the mask back on, and he starts to chase the octopus down into the dark depths of the ocean. I said, Paul, why in the world would you do such a thing? It's crazy. He said, he can't explain it. He's a hardcore scientist, one of the most respected in oceanography. And he's embarrassed to use the word spiritual, but he said he thinks of it as a spiritual experience. Whether it was or not, he said, I did not want those moments to end. I did not want those moments to end. Story after story that I collected talked about something that happens between the other animal and the person experiencing that animal, particularly wild animals. I had an experience like that. I was out in my boat on a lake, and early morning I saw what I thought were two turkey buzzards on the shore eating a dead carp. And I wanted to look at them closer, so I eased up. I have a little electric motor, so I eased up on them. And they were not turkey vultures. They were two giant golden eagles. And you don't get within 20 feet of golden eagles very often. And I stayed there and I went back and forth very quietly. And the eagles continued to eat. They'd look up at me and they'd take a bite, look up at me, do that. Went on for what seemed like forever. One of the things that people have these encounters say is that there are some altered states that can be named. One of them is time seems to disappear or bend during those moments. That happened to me. And I went home and told my son about this, who was home from college. And I said, I can't explain, but something happened between me and the eagles. I can't tell you what the eagles were thinking. Maybe they were just trying to decide if I was edible.
Yeah.
And I can't really tell you what I was thinking, because what was happening was between me and the eagles. It's very much like what Paul Dayton described. And in the book, over time, I decided that thing that is between us and other life needs to be named and respected. There's a famous philosopher named Martin Buber, and I always have to be careful not to say Justin Bieber. And Martin Buber wrote a famous essay. He was talking about people, about you and I, Colin. He said that you and I don't really exist. What exists is between us. It's the relationship. Without that relationship, we don't exist to each other. And I thought that's true with our experiences with animals too. It's between us. And so I like to name things. So I named that the habitat of the heart. And that's a theme in the book. I think there are two habitats. There's the natural habitat, the reality, natural habitat, physical natural habitat. And we spend a lot of time trying to protect that, preserve it, and teach our children about it. Then there's this other habitat, the habitat of the heart. And we spend very little time talking about that or teaching our children about that or preserving or growing that habitat of the heart. And the thing is, if one of those habitats goes, I believe, so does the other one. So it's just as important to attend the habitat of the heart, our relationship with other animals and with trees, with all of nature, and to preserve that and grow that. It's just as important to do that as it is to conserve land, to protect species, endangered species, and all that. Both of those are needed. And I think that the progress toward protecting nature will increase when more of us attend to the habitat of the heart. And I think small children understand this intuitively, but the society talks them out of it over time. And so I know that's a little bit vague answer to your question, but that's the most important answer to me.
Thanks, Richard. Yeah, lots to think about there and digest and yeah, appreciate some of those stories too. For students, I mean, I think just shifting as well, you know, we talk about sort of the importance of vitamins on a day like today, Taking Outside Day. We often frame it of, you know, we need to go outside to get vitamin D. In your book, The Nature Principle, you talk about vitamin N. I'm just wondering if you can share with students a little bit about what vitamin N means, and I think some of the stories that we're hearing about doctors even prescribing vitamin N.
Yeah. Well, first, I happen, shameless promotion here, I wrote a book called Vitamin N. And it's the kind of book I don't like to read. It's things you can do, 500 things that families and communities can do to increase vitamin N. And basically that's the shorthand for the benefits we get from nature to our physical health, our psychological health, our ability to learn and create. And families can do that, individuals can do it, kids can do it for themselves. They can just make the decision to spend more time outside. And think about how they're feeling when they do that. The studies show that being outside reduces the symptoms of attention deficit disorder. It reduces depression. It makes our hearts healthier, reduces our stress hormones. There's a long list of benefits we get from that, and that's why I call it vitamin N. In 2010, I was asked to give the keynote, excuse me, the keynote speech to the American Academy of Pediatrics, their national meeting, and I was talking to several thousand pediatricians and pediatric nurse practitioners and others. And I suggested that just maybe they ought to start prescribing it, vitamin N. And to my surprise, a lot of them did that. There's one doctor that was there that day. He went back to Washington, D.C. He started to literally write, he made a prescription pad, said vitamin N. He started to literally write prescriptions for families to go outside in nature. Then he organized the other pediatricians in Washington, D.C. to do the same thing. And they didn't stop there. They created a database of all of the parks and open space in Washington, D.C. so that the doctor could not only, in talking to the family, prescribe it, he or she could turn to the computer and say, there's a park 5 blocks from your house, and here's what it's like, and here's what you can get there to fulfill your prescription for vitamin N. Now in Canada, that's spread to Canada. It's all over the United States now. And in Canada, it is the latest country that has really gotten on board on that. And I'm not quite sure how pharmacists work in Canada. It's probably different than the United States. But pharmacists now are prescribing, in Canada, are prescribing vitamin N.
Yeah, it's. I think it's definitely something that should be prescribed more of, but something we need to take accountability for as well. I think whenever I've chatted with students, they know that they need to take a break from the time that they're spending in front of screens. They know how the positive impacts that come from spending time outside. And so I think you've alluded to that. Sometimes we have a choice to make about how we spend our time, about how we budget our time. And I think making that commitment to that time outside can really have long-lasting benefits. Richard, I think, maybe this ties into a little bit, like in the education system here in Canada, we're really, there is a concerted effort. It always needs more work, but there's a concerted effort to address truth and reconciliation. And I know that and part of that in the work that we're doing really revolves around trying to connect students to the land and really sort of embed Indigenous ways of knowing into that time outside. I know over the years you've talked with numerous Indigenous knowledge keepers and healers. Wondering sort of if you could mention a few things that you think are really important that we can learn from Indigenous ways of knowing.
Well, first, I neglected to say that I'm speaking to you from the ancestral land of the Kumeyaay. That welcome to country, that's what it's called. I don't know if it's called that in Canada. It's called that in Australia. The beginning of every conference, an Indigenous person from that region opens it with a prayer, with a song, with a speech. I had never seen that before I went to Australia about 10 years ago, and I was really impressed by it. It changed the nature of the conference somehow. It made it more serious. We're in difficult times in which we have to be very careful. Cultural appropriation is real, and when we suggest ways of connecting to nature that are Indigenous in origin, and many of them are, and when we do not give specific credit We do indigenous people and ourselves harm. Having said that, and I can't remember the name of this publication, but it comes out of Canada, and it has been sent to many teachers and schools, and a lot of this has been pulled together by representatives of First Nations in Canada, where they're trying to apply some of these lessons to schools, public schools, to the classroom and outside the classroom. You know, so many of the senses that we talk about that we have lost because of living in too much technology, they were just assumed by many indigenous people. The sensitivity to what's around us, you know, listening, watching, being very tuned in to the great conversation around us. Indigenous people knew that much more than our direct ancestors did. By our, I mean you and mine, Colin. And there's much to be learned from that. And one of the things with the Children of Nature movement, which emerged after Last Child in the Woods came out, that I always wanted to see is I wanted to see more indigenous leaders leading that movement. Some of that has changed, but I wish there was more.
Thanks for that. Yeah. Maybe just to finish off, I think the formal questions, and then we do have some student questions coming in. You know, what I think you've alluded to a little bit through some of your stories, through some of your answers, but if I was to ask you directly, what can students do to help them get to know nature around them and become more connected to nature? Do you have any advice for students watching today?
Yeah, let me just give you a list of one-liners, because if I stick on any one of these, I'll talk too long. And these come from Vitamin N, and each of these is described in detail, and sources, books, and websites are offered under each one of these. Probably the most important thing for both students and parents, or one of the most important, is to put it on the calendar. You know, we can schedule soccer. Surely we can schedule time in nature. But some of and I'll just do these one-liners, is go on a moonwalk. Go outside at night and just feel the magic that happens and the animals that you will hear, at least, that you don't hear during the day. Go with your parents and teach them about it. Be a cloud spotter. Clouds are astonishing, and this can be done from your room. If you have a disability or you're a disabled student and you don't have the ability for whatever reason to go outside, cloud spotting is great. There's a book put out by the Cloud Spotters Society that helps us name different clouds and look for faces in the clouds and look at how they change. Where we live now, we have a big picture window, and the clouds come up from the desert over the mountains, and they go up thousands of feet, and I'll sit there and watch them go all the way up. And there's a magic in those clouds. And then when you see the raptors flying past them. Anyhow, we talked earlier about build your hybrid mind, not only technology, but nature. Rotate the senses. When you're out in the woods, consciously don't only use your eyes, use your nose. When I was a kid, I'd go out in the woods and I'd wet my nose, with my tongue. I can't reach my nose with my tongue, but you know what I mean. And because I had read somewhere in some book about Daniel Boone or something, that you can smell better, and you can when you do that. So that's using a sense you don't realize you're using all the time, and sharpening it. Go on a belly hike. This is from a neat book about things like that. That means get down on the ground and scoot yourself along and look at the little details And if you see an ant walking by, follow the ant and look at all the life that is in the humus below you. It's a whole different world. I mentioned we have some of the skills of bloodhounds. Actually try to develop those skills to close your eyes and cover your ears and see what you can sense just from your nose. There's something called using a snake tongue, deer eyes, or owl eyes, and I won't go into a lot of detail, but snakes sense things with their tongue, and you can do that. There's a whole list of things you can do to rotate your senses. One of the things I have in there is be a Batman or Batwoman. What that means is use echolocation. We have, as human beings, some of the skills of bats, that we can make our way in a dark building just using our ears. And some people have developed this for people who, for blind people, to use their tongues to make clicks, and they can hear the echo off the walls of a room. Now that takes a long time to develop, but there's even one famous case of a kid that learned how to ride his bicycle just using echolocation. I don't advise that, but these senses are remarkable when you start to develop it. And people who have lost some of their senses or were born without them, of course, know this already. They turn to other senses if they've lost their sight, for instance. There's something called pinpoint vision. And that means that's kind of what I was talking about, really honing in on one little thing, on the little things in front of you and studying those. Use your peripheral vision. Peripheral vision, it turns out, is a lot more powerful than we know or than we've been taught usually. And that's when you pick up things from the sides of your eyes. Peripheral vision is much better than direct vision at picking up danger, detecting danger in the area, because a peripheral vision looks for what's out of place and knows that and will make you turn your head. So you can consciously begin to use your peripheral vision more than you usually do. Let's see. Well, you can learn to track. I mean, trackers are amazing. One of the things I've been thinking about recently is how we can time travel. You know, dogs. This isn't something brand new. Dogs time travel. If you ever go outside the house and come back, your dog will probably come and sniff your feet, the soles of your feet. It wants to know where you've been, and it reconstructs where you've been, so it can go backward in time. But there's some thought that some animals can actually sense forward in time because they can make calculations about where you're going to go next based on where you've been. I think we can do that too, in a way. There are, near where I live, where I walk, there are slabs of, there's an area that has a big slab of granite. And in that slab are some moteros. These are the holes that you'll find in areas like this that can be thousands of years old, where Aboriginal women and maybe some men would grind acorns. And as they do that, these holes get deeper and deeper in the rock. I was thinking the other day, I was looking at that. I was walking by and I stopped. And I used my imagination. That's another sense to use. I could hear the women grinding the acorns. I know that sounds strange, but that's the power of the imagination. I could hear them talking with each other. I could hear them singing, looking out over the big valley in front of us. And often these moteros have found places just like that, the rock, and then defensible space, a big open area in front of them. So I was looking out at the valley in front of this rock, and I was imagining who lived there before, what people lived there before, what Animals lived there before, thousands of years ago. There's a mountain across the valley from me. Its name is Vulcan Mountain. It's about 5,000 feet tall. I know from having studied it at one time, that mountain was twice its height, a long time ago. It was 10,000 feet, and it's been worn down. So using my imagination, I can see that. I can see that bigger mountain. I can see rocks coming over from a giant volcano that occurred in Mexico that dropped specifically red rocks all over this region in which I live. So William Blake, the great poet and mystic, believed that we can see, and by see he means perceive, 4 ways. And I won't go into the last 2, but the first 2 are what scientists use.
Unknown caller.
It's what scientists use to, I'm sorry, see, technology. Scientists will look at a tree or an animal and they will see it as an object. Not all scientists, but that's one of the basic things, and kind of measure it in their mind. That's one way of seeing. Second way of seeing, said William Blake, the great poet, is use your imagination. And he meant that in a much broader way than we usually think about the imagination. It turns out that in our wild calling, and I think this is something that ought to be taught in schools, I interviewed a professor who's worked out something he calls critical anthropomorphism. And basically said, if you want to study a snake, you have to become the snake. He said, in looking at a snake, studying a snake, the first step, there's 2 steps, he said. First step is conjure up all the hard science in your mind that you already know about snakes. What is it doing with its tongue? What does science tell us? The second step is use your imagination. To the extent of our limited abilities, sense what the snake senses. Sense what it's like to be that snake, become the snake. Now, that's a stretch. It's unlikely that we can pick a lot of that up, but we can pick some of it up. And what he says is this is empathy. This is having empathy for that snake, or for all the animals around us and for nature itself. That's a different way of perceiving the world. So this professor is actually doing the first 2 steps that hundreds of years ago, William Blake, the poet, recommended.
That's great. Yeah, lots of good stories. And thanks so much, Richard. We have a couple minutes left, and we do have some questions coming in from students and classes from various schools. If you have just a couple minutes, I'll just ask a couple. One is fairly straightforward, but it's going to put you on the spot because it's, but Mrs. Dermott's grade 5-6 class are asking, what is your favorite wild animal?
It changes from time to time. Right now, probably my favorite wild animals is a mountain lion. And the reason is we have mountain lions in our yard. I have webcams, which, by the way, is one of those ways to use technology to connect to nature. I have several around our property. I have about an acre here up on the mountain. And I picked up several mountain lions, feet from our house. My wife got up real early one morning and actually saw one. And most people who live up here have never seen one. And she was lucky enough to see one. But mountain lions see us all the time. They're watching. This area has a particularly high population of mountain lions. So I think that's my favorite one right now.
Awesome.
I also like possums, by the way. Picked up a possum on my webcam 2 nights ago, and they're just great to watch walk across the yard.
I bet. Another question from Miss Everett's awesome 8th grade class. Students here are curious about the wolf pack human connection, whether the wolf influencing human evolution is just behavioral, or if there might have been genetic or physical impacts of this connection. So them to us.
From them to us. That's a real interesting question, if I understand it right. You know, when wolves or foxes are domesticated and bred, in Russia, there's a program where they breed foxes. They take wild foxes and they breed them. And it takes just a few generations for those foxes to essentially turn into dogs. At some point along the way, they start having spots. Their pattern on their fur changes. It's really remarkable. I think obviously wolves have changed into dogs, their physical form, but to wonder about whether our physical form has changed because of wolves / dogs, I wonder. I have never thought about that before. I'd like that class to tell me the answer that they think. You know, if they want to send me what they think about that, because that's an interesting question I never thought of.
Yes, thanks to Miss Everett's.
Thank you, Ms.
Great
Everett.
class. Yeah, they also said they really love your ringtone on your phone.
Oh, of crickets?
Yes.
I could have just said that's just crickets. That's not my phone.
Yeah. Maybe one last question here. This is from Kayla. I have a feeling Kayla might be an educator, but she's asking, what are your thoughts on using place-based education and some of the work that David Sobel has done to engage students in exploring their local nature and community?
Well, David Sobel is one of my heroes. He's really a great guy. Was one of the few people really looking at this when I started writing about it, the human nature connection in education. And right now, there is a movement in the United States, and I'm sure in Canada. In fact, I should say, I should have had his name up. I can't remember his name. I've signed on to work with a group of Canadian educators who are starting an effort to focus on play in schools. And they've got a list of schools across Canada that they're going to start working with to increase the amount of learning through play. And I apologize for not having the name of that group and his name. Right now, in both countries, there is a natural play space movement where playgrounds are being turned into natural play spaces. I think it's enormously important. Some of the studies have shown how kids play differently if they're playing in a natural play space compared to a typical flat asphalt or cement playground. The kids who play in the natural play space, which has some grass to roll down, and maybe a log to climb, maybe a garden, those kinds of things. The kids playing in a natural play space are far more likely to invent their own games, which is incredibly important. It's incredibly important for what's called executive function. I think it's incredible. If we want entrepreneurs in the future, there's an economic aspect of this, then we'll have more natural play spaces because kids learn to invent their own games instead of just following the adults' orders. Also, the kids who play on these natural play spaces are far more likely than they would on a typical traditional playground to invite kids to play with them who don't look like them or of a different race or culture or gender. It's far more inclusive. It just seems to naturally happen in natural play spaces. So I think it's incredible. Now, obviously, during the pandemic, some people suddenly recognized that outdoor classrooms might be a good idea because of social distancing. This is not a new idea. During the great pandemic, tuberculosis pandemic of the early 20th century, there were playgrounds on the top of play spaces on the top of skyscrapers in New York City where kids were learning outdoors because of being farther away and fresh air. This is not new. These are not new ideas. But finally, what I want to say is that something I've noticed I've been out giving sermonettes for 16 years or something like that since last child on this topic. So on this broad topic. So I've met a lot of teachers and a lot of parents and a lot of kids. And I've tried to keep learning from them. And teachers, not only in the United States, but in Canada and in other countries too, often would come up to me after my speech. And they would say, you know, the troublemaker in my class becomes the leader when I take the class outdoors. Not just better behaved, the leader. They would say this almost with the exact same words. I've heard that hundreds of times from teachers, almost using the same. And yes, I know troublemaker is probably not the right word to use, but teachers use it when they talk to me about it. And I thought, I've thought about those kids sitting at the back of the class, and maybe some of them are listening right now, you know, wearing black and they're kind of sullen. And they don't feel included. I think some of those students are the kind of students who would come alive and become the leaders if we had more education outdoors. And the final thought of that is the way we're doing it now, not your school, but schools necessarily, but certainly the standard way that we're excluding those kids and not taking kids outside because we do learn differently. I wonder how many leaders are we losing in the future? This is a time when we need great leaders and everyday leaders more than ever before. And I've been thinking for a while that the future will belong to the nature smart. So getting all of those kids, not just some of them, but all of them, including in urban areas, very urban areas, outdoors, and there is nature in urban areas, is an investment in leadership, is an investment in the future of our countries.
Great. Thanks so much, Richard. I think, you know, for the teachers and students who are on this and those that will watch the recording, we just really want to thank Richard for his time. If you can stay on, we have some prizes to give out, but we want to let Richard go and continue on with his day. Richard, thanks so much. You've given us a lot to think about. I think some really good insight that students can take away and think about and chat about with their teachers. So thanks for this today. Really appreciate your time and look forward to being in touch again.
You're welcome, and I'm sorry my answers are always so long that I couldn't get to all the questions. But that one class that asked about how people have physically changed because of the influence of wolves and then dogs, I'd like to know the answer to that if you want to email me. So
great. Thanks, Richard.
Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye. And for the schools that are still on, we do have some great prizes to give away. So let's get right to it. We just want to thank some of our partners. In particular, we want to thank the Outdoor Learning Store for their support throughout Take Me Outside Week. The Outdoor Learning Store offers supplies for teachers to help get their students outside. They are giving away a $25 Outdoor Learning Store gift card. And so let's see here. We are giving that to Miss McCormick's grade 5 class. Miss McCormick's grade 5 class. Charlotte, who is helping us today, part of the Take Me Outside team, is just going to put a quick message up there that if you win a prize, you can email info@takemeoutside.ca today. And
it doesn't look like Miss McCormick's class is actually still here anymore.
It doesn't.
No,
right.
but I see there's a backup, Miss Everett's 8th grade class with
They
the
were one of the
outdoor.
ones that asked the question. Yes, that's great. Miss Everett's amazing grade 8 class. you are the winner of a $25 outdoor learning gift card. We also want to thank another one of our partners, MEC, for their continued support. So thanks to MEC for helping throughout Take Me Outside Week. And for prizes, we have 3 prizes left. We have a copy of the Imagine Ed Walking Curriculum book by Jillian Judson. Steph, can you help me out here? We are going to give that to...
Yeah, it looks like we're gonna give that to Asima Kazi Coutinho, the Walking Curriculum book. So please, if you're selected as a winner, please send us your email in the chat too. We put our email up in the chat, but if you send that to us, we can get in touch with you a little bit easier.
Awesome, congrats Asima. And another prize, we have a subscription to the Green Teacher magazine, and that is going to go to Nikki Jones. Nikki Jones, if you're still on the call, you are the winner of that. Congratulations, Nikki.
I don't see a Nikki Jones still attending, but if you are in there, please do type and speak up.
Sounds good. And Steph or Charlotte, we just need one more winner for the last subscription to the Green Teacher magazine. Actually, we have one. If Felicia Smith is still on the call. Felicia?
Doesn't look like it, based on just searching through the attendees here.
They were just there, I promise. Just 1 second.
What?
I did have my last,
Oh,
but I'm just checking to see that they're here.
So Jen Upton spoke up and said that she's one of your students. Jen, you might have to claim that on her behalf, because Green Teacher is probably more suited to teachers than to students.
That's great, but Jen, we'll follow up with you, or you can send us your email and we'll follow up for that. But thanks again so much for participating in today's conversation with Richard Louv. And we do wish you a really happy Take Me Outside Day today. Hopefully you are able to spend some time outside if you haven't already yet. And we have some great webinars coming up tomorrow. We have 2 environmental activists joining us, Larissa Crawford and Mario Rigby. And on Friday, we have an Indigenous storyteller, Cecilia, joining us at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. So still some things yet to come for Take Me Outside Week. But thanks again for joining us, and we hope to be in touch soon. Take care.